Everyone. All right, so today we are starting with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Uh, and with this, we begin our first sort of proper ethical theory, right? There are three traditional ethical theories: virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism. And uh, Aristotle is the foundation of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics gets picked up in the 20th century and sort of refined and revised. So often when people refer to virtue ethics, they're referring to a number of 20th century ethicists who draw their inspiration from Aristotle. Above all, Martha Nussbaum is probably the most prominent virtue ethicist. But Aristotle is the foundation of that virtue ethics, and it's reasonable to understand Aristotle's ethics themselves along the same lines as virtue ethics. This idea of virtue is the key idea in Aristotle as it is in Nussbaum and 20th century thinkers. But Aristotle is also the first to write a treatise sort of explicitly on ethics. In fact, he is the first to write a treatise on ethics. He's the first to think of ethics as ethics. And one of the things I want to talk about as we begin Book One of the Nicomachean Ethics is the relation between Aristotle and Plato, just a little bit. Because it's true that Aristotle introduces the idea of ethics as a kind of system of behavior, uh, rules for life. To put it in a self-help kind of way. And there's certainly aspects of Aristotle's ethics that resemble self-help. Uh, Prior to Aristotle, um, rather than asking about ethics, philosophers would ask about the good, nature of the good. And Plato, who was Aristotle's teacher, uh, talks a lot about the nature of the good. So the difference between Plato and Aristotle, and the change that Aristotle makes, uh, is that we're no longer asking about, in Aristotle, no longer asking about kind of transcendental, abstract, and objective good, but instead asking about how to live a good life, how to be happy. And as we'll see, Aristotle's ethics are all about happiness. So, uh, Aristotle's dates are 384 BC to 322 BC. And as I just said, Aristotle was a student of Plato's, and in turn, Plato was a student of Socrates. Uh, the question of the good, the question of what is right, begins with Socrates. And it's developed through Plato into theory of universal and transcendental good. Uh, I don't want to go into too much detail, at least not right now, about Plato's philosophy and Plato's metaphysics and how they're related to the idea of the good, how that might be related to ethics. Uh, but we'll say for now that for Plato, there was a form of the good. Plato's theory of forms uh, referred to the ideas that he believed were the real foundation of reality. Plato, ideas are the foundation of the physical world. We'll talk about this more in a minute. But so from Socrates to Plato, the good is developed as an abstract form. when Aristotle comes around, ethics as a question of how to live life, of uh, how to behave, becomes separate from the metaphysical question of an objective, absolute good. Aristotle's ethics are about how to behave, right? Uh, but more seriously, they're about action. For Aristotle, the key to ethics, the key to happiness, uh, is knowing what to do. Uh, so, one of the important questions that I think we think about with Aristotle, or that Aristotle raises, is whether or not there's such a thing as a good person. In thinking about ethics and thinking about politics, philosophy generally, uh, do we think that people are inherently good, or do people become good or become bad based on the things they do? Does their action determine their character, or does their character determine their action? For Plato, it was generally that character determined action, that there were certain people that had inherently better souls, uh, souls that were naturally predisposed to doing justice. Uh, and I think, I think about this all the time, actually, in the United States, and the way that we think about good and bad, and the way we deal with ethics and bad behavior. Uh, it seems to me that the stronger impulse in culture is to believe that there are good and bad people, uh, and that if you do something bad, that means you're a bad person. Uh, interestingly, it seems like there's less conviction that if you do something good, you're a good person, right? But doing something bad makes you a bad person. Only bad people do bad things. Uh, this is this is not Aristotle's view, certainly, but the very idea of good and bad people uh, goes in some ways against all of Aristotelian ethics. Um, it's a complicated question, and even Aristotle doesn't deal with it as well as he might. It's sort of famously something that he struggles to clarify. Uh, but in any case, this is a question that we should bear in mind as we read Aristotle. And I think it's the sort of question that makes Aristotle continually remain relevant, remain important in ethics. Because for Aristotle, ethics is all about action. And in order to become good, in order to become ethical, to be happy, one has to know what to do. And in order to know what to do, one has to learn uh, what is required to act. In other words, one has to learn what action is. And this is, I think, the deepest part of Aristotelian ethics, uh, is that it forces us to think about how we can make ourselves act. Uh, and what I mean by this is, in terms of action, uh, how we can change our habits, how we can uh, change our sort of daily lives, how we can improve. Right, that's the self-help element of Aristotle. How can we will ourselves to become better? But also, right, Aristotle asks how we can know how to take action that will transform the world, transform the political arena. Uh, what is required in order to become an effective political agent, political actor? For Aristotle, ethics is about action and politics is about action. Uh, so, learning how to act will also be learning how to be an ethical political leader, or an ethical person and a good political leader. The question about action is especially interesting and important because it is one of the places where Aristotle challenges Platonic metaphysics. And so we'll talk about that a little bit also. The last note about the purpose of Aristotle's ethics is in keeping with the fact that he is not interested in a transcendental and absolute sense of good. He thinks that the purpose of ethics is not to become aligned with absolute justice or the form of justice, but rather to produce happiness. So, ethics is the study of action that will lead to happiness both at an individual level and at the level of the collective, at the political level. Yeah. All right. So before we begin, I guess it's useful, before we begin going through the text, let's talk about a few of the key terms, really just two of the key terms in Aristotle's work. The first is virtue itself. Virtue is the traditional translation of the Greek word arete. And arete doesn't mean virtue, perhaps in the sense that we mean it. What does virtue mean anyway? What is a virtue? Who decides? Probably, the connotation of virtue today is has to do with the church, the Catholic Church, and maybe above all, the cardinal virtues, right, of the Catholic Church. Those cardinal virtues are a translation of the traditional ancient virtues of ancient Greece. The virtues are wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. But virtue, right, was translation of this Greek word arete. And arete might better be translated as an excellence, the excellence of courage, right? And in the sense that it is an excellence of character. A virtue is a character trait, a characteristic, a way of being that makes you excellent, makes you a good person. And I think that the important distinction here between virtue and excellence is that virtue, it feels tied to that transcendental idea of the good. It feels abstract, it feels otherworldly, it feels as though it belongs to a concept of an eternal soul. And that's not what Aristotle has in mind by virtue. Right? What Aristotle has in mind is an excellence that befits one's whole being, not just as an individual, but as part of a collective, part of a group. Uh, so the cardinal virtues, the cardinal excellences, are found in those people that are, um, the most dynamic, the best able to navigate their private lives, their social worlds, and also the political world. Excellence is the ability to thrive, right? The ability to succeed. Which brings us to the next term that needs to be clarified before we delve into the text, which is happiness. I've already said in this introduction that the purpose of ethics for Aristotle is happiness. Uh, and happiness is a translation of another Greek term, eudaimonia. And happiness is an all right translation. It works, right? But again, there's a question of connotation, a question of sort of implied meaning in happiness. What does it mean to be happy? What does it mean to be? What does it mean to be happy? Happiness is a kind of joyfulness, right? Happiness is right connected to being happy-go-lucky. Perhaps we associate happiness, uh, perhaps with a kind of stupidity, right? In the sense that people would say, "I'd rather be smart than happy," something along those lines. Uh, Happiness is easily attained, right? The foolish are happy, etc. So happiness has the wrong sense. What Aristotle means by eudaimonia is, again, something that engages one's whole being. Uh, a better translation of it might be flourishing, right? The point of ethics is to flourish. And the goal of studying ethics is to learn uh, how to become excellent so as to flourish. uh, Flourishing. Now, the other connotation to eudaimonia, and in fact, a more literal translation of the word, would be well-gottedness. Eu is the prefix meaning good. Daimon means spirit or god, demigod. Socrates famously had a daimon with whom he would converse, who followed him around. It's a kind of divine companion, I suppose, would be the best translation. So to have a good daimon, right, to be well-fated would be another way to put it. And it's an important connotation to bear in mind because, as we'll see, happiness, flourishing, depends largely on one's excellence, one's virtue, on having developed a good character. But it will also always depend somewhat on fate, on chance, and on accident. We'll look at the section where Aristotle talks about that in a minute. All right, so that is our introduction to